Okay, let's start. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here today. I'm going to move to Spanish just for a minute to explain to those who weren't here yesterday how to get on the Spanish channel if they would like to hear this conference in Spanish. So, hola, gracias por estar aquí esta tarde. Si no fui aquí ayer y desea escuchar esta conferencia en español, nuestra intérprete Eva está lista para traducirla. Para ir al canal en español, ubique un icono en el lado inferior derecho de su barra de menú. Es un icono de un globo terráqueo con las palabras Interpretation. Haga clic en el globo terráqueo, seleccione español y haga clic Mute Original Audio para silenciar el audio en inglés. ¿Estás preparado? Y solo escucharás a Eva. Después del panel de discusión, responderemos preguntas. Si tienen alguna pregunta, escríbelo en el Q&A. Eva traducirá vuestra pregunta al inglés. Aquí está instrucciones. Okay, so hello, I'm Erica Aitken. I'm with Reimagine Santa Cruz. I want to thank you for being here on the second day of the conference. Because we covered a lot yesterday, I won't go into what Reimagine Santa Cruz is, except to say that we hope to be a channel of communication around issues like housing. And we plan to continue making videos, writing articles, and organize events such as these. Our format is as such. We'll begin by a keynote presentation and we'll follow with a panel discussion. Today's panelists are all experts in what touches affordable housing. They find solution, they shape policy, and they are advocates. After the discussion, we'll have a question and answer time, and we'll ask you to write your questions in the Q&A field. Our moderator today is Jim Weller. Please welcome Sibley Simon. He is the founder and president of New Way Homes and Envision Housing. He will lay out a new approach to our housing affordability crisis. Sibley, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I'm pulling up my slides. So hopefully, tell me if the slide changes. Did it change?
It changes.
Okay, great. It only works 80% of the time on Zoom, so that's great to hear. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the housing crisis problems that we see and feel, and then talk about what is New Way Homes. I've been on a journey these last 6 years of trying to see how I could help with the housing crisis. I've learned a ton. I've changed my mindset on lots of topics related to this through that journey, and I'm excited to just share what I'm trying to create, and also what I've learned through that process. So the third topic there: what else have I learned so far? So I hope that's useful in helping people think more about the housing crisis and what we do about it in Santa Cruz. But first, I'm going to share my New Year's resolution, which is that, like a lot of us who think a lot about housing or work on housing or especially getting discussions about housing, my blood pressure goes up when I start thinking about all the problems we have with housing and how difficult it is to do about it, or why can't we just do X? So my own New Year's resolution that I'm sharing is really this year in 2021 to respect the varied motivations and priorities of everyone who lives in Santa Cruz and who shows up to talk about these things at events like this, at City Council, et cetera. And I know, when I hear people's concerns, they're from real experience or from fears about what might happen. And I want to pay more attention to those and respect them and listen to gain understanding in 2021. And then lastly, realizing through this journey that no one statement about housing is 100% true, probably including that statement. So it's so complicated, and it's so easy to either debate something by pointing out the 5% of the time it's not true, or to over rely on something as if it's completely true. So trying to embrace the nuance and think about things a little bit more. What's the problem? One thing that I've learned, okay, we all know there's a housing crisis. We see it, we hear about it, we see different aspects of it. But I've come to think of it in a framework of not just one crisis, three major parts. And I'll tell you why I think this is important. One is, we heard about this last night. I'm not going to say a lot more about this right now, but there's a huge housing shortage. And last night's presentation characterized that as we're playing musical chairs with housing, we're auctioning off housing to the highest bidder, et cetera. That's one component of the housing crisis. Another, I'm calling them economic problems. I keep changing what I call this, but the thing is, having nationally, it's a national problem everywhere in the country. It doesn't have to be here where there's a housing shortage. Everywhere there are individuals and families that can't afford any safe, not overcrowded housing where they live in that community. And so we have a social safety net problem. We have an income inequality problem with widening and widening inequality. And that's separate element to the housing crisis. And there's a big racial inequality problem. So really, we're a very segregated society today, and incredible racial wealth gap. And that means that these other elements of the housing crisis disproportionately, they affect many people, everyone, they affect everyone, but they disproportionately affect folks who are low income and folks who are people of color. And what I have, the reason I keep touching back on this framework of thinking about these three main areas of the housing crisis is that I find a lot of the debates statewide we're having housing, and sometimes in our local community, about this is obviously what we should do, that's obviously not what we should do, come down to people trying to solve one of these, or trying to make sure that a solution to one of these doesn't make another one worse. So the real obvious case is like if you just build any kind of housing in low-income neighborhoods and cause displacement, and the brunt of that is on people of color, okay, that might help the first category and make the last category worse, for example. And there's many examples of that going around. So I like to, when we start thinking about and debating what should we do about housing, to making sure we're trying to address all of these problems, or at least address one of them well without making the others worse, as a goal. And we all know, I'm not going to go into all this, but we see the effects of the housing crisis or crises all over the place. Good stuff goes down, bad stuff goes up. And just incredible suffering. I keep coming back to, we're the state with the highest poverty rate when you include housing costs, which is just astounding. And really environmental issues as well. This one I've had in my thinking for a while, and is in the conversation, statewide, about how, we can't meet our climate goals if we don't reduce vehicle miles traveled, and the human costs of having ever longer commutes. But just as a side note, the other topic related to that, I've just been diving into more, and I was just on a call today with a group of environmental groups trying to figure out how do we lower the rate of housing development in really the wildlands, and realizing that a lot of the pressure for that comes from the lack of zoned housing capability, or lack of allowing housing to be created where people are actually working and where there's transit. And some people always want to build, out in the wildlands, but a lot of that comes from that pressure. And so there's way more and more alliances being built between environmental groups trying to lower that pressure of development in wildlands, or in the WUI, the wildland urban interface, and infill housing efforts. So jumping back a little bit, my original motivation was I'd been a tech entrepreneur. I stopped doing that, wanted to be involved more in the community. I helped start the 180, what was the 180 initiative. Now it's called 180 Together. And now that's helped over 1,000 chronically homeless individuals in Santa Cruz County into housing. But early on, I was getting frustrated that our rate of success there, and obviously we have not eliminated chronic homelessness in Santa Cruz County, and really feeling like, well, that's coming from the housing market, that other places in the country are doing exactly the same thing, eliminating chronic homelessness. We are not, comes from the housing market. And if we're trying to help folks into housing who don't have it, It's just, we put so much effort into finding the housing unit. So my original motivation into getting into housing development was, well, how can I just create some units for that purpose, for the helping folks who don't have any housing into housing. That was a great thought, but it led to a pretty big road. And the first part was figuring out, well, how do we create housing now? How do we do housing development? Maybe we could do some more of that. And I really realized, okay, there's two models that we pursue for housing development today. One is the publicly funded housing. So this combines pretty complex set of funding mechanisms, and that's unfortunately part of the problem. It takes projects a long time because it's very complex getting enough funding in total to build affordable housing. And some of those funding mechanisms, this is not every single time, but 99% of the time, those funding mechanisms require the projects to be pretty big. So it's just a big mountain to climb where you got to do a whole project that's all affordable in one place. When you get that done, that's amazing, and builds housing that's restricted to lower income levels, mostly very low income level, and is totally affordable and based on the income of those tenants. Rents are based on the income. So that is amazing. It's the best kind of housing in a lot of ways for the affordability crisis, best kind of housing we can have. Unfortunately, is such a vast need that there's these lotteries that's, your odds are better than winning the California lottery, but it still feels like that you got a 1 in 100 chance or even less of getting a unit if you qualify and apply. So, that's great, and we need to do more of it. And so I wanted to just take one quick moment here and urge people, we still have a lot more to do to maximize what we can do in our communities with this publicly funded housing model. So it's not what I'm working on with my day job, but I spend time on this too because we need to do more of it. And I think Don mentioned last night, one of the things that some other communities in California have that we don't have is a real organized effort, community organization that removes barriers to these affordable housing projects, that advocates for local sources of funding, that does whatever it takes to get more of this. We haven't been getting our fair share of this in our county, and it's up to us to try to do more. And so this is a more coordinated effort to try to have that, like SV at Home, which is an organization in Santa Clara County. We need one here. It's called Housing Santa Cruz County. It's about to launch. Don, who was on last night, is one of the leaders of that. New Way Homes is playing a supportive role by being the fiscal sponsor for this, just doing the back end bookkeeping and whatever we can do logistically to help this effort. And so there's the website. There's going to be a kickoff event soon. So I bet most people here tonight are going to be interested in that. I hope you go become a member, check out that. So I can't say enough about that. Now, all that said, we have a lot to do in that category, but it's not enough by itself. And we've gotten to this incredible problem with the housing crisis that we have to do more than one thing at the same time. So not to take away from that, but the fact is we've been building publicly funded housing for decades, quite a few decades, and only about 10% of all the lower income households in California live in it. And right now we create about 20,000 units of publicly funded affordable housing per year in California. And that's only just keeping that 10% level at about 10% because the population grows a bit. Unfortunately, we lose some, so we have to preserve what we have, affordable housing. So there is hope of trying to do more to increase that rate, even California-wide. Every year, the legislature is looking at putting more money into this now when it has it. That's great. But even if we double this, even if we do better than that, it would take years to get up to 15% of lower income households living in affordable housing. So it can't be the only thing we do. And unfortunately, really, if you look at the numbers, everybody who doesn't have affordable housing now in California have tried to create housing that was publicly funded affordable housing for them. Be $1 trillion, just the missing units that we have. And so that's not feasible for a state to do. Okay, we can get into what national politics should be. And looking at that and saying, okay, how do we help have more affordable housing? Quickly realized, and you probably knew this before I did, we have lots of great nonprofit affordable housing developers here. These are just three of the biggest ones in the Monterey Bay region, but there's some others too. And so those folks are experts at using all that funding. So we need to do more to take down barriers, help them get more funding, et cetera, and they can build that housing. That's great. The second thing we do is what we call market rate housing. It's not the best title because a lot of things can fall under that, but we know what it means. That was talked about last night, so I'm not going to go back through that. You know, high risk, it's been seen as high risk. So the capital willing to fund that is capital that demands a high return. And that's, I will say, I get asked about that a lot. And the reality is, you know, only projects that look in a model like they could get 20% return, say, annual return on that invested capital get funded this way in general. But that's because there's seen as so many risks to, you know, 10 years of delays on the project, or construction costs go up, or a variety of other things, or some projects get canceled altogether, such that a lot of the funds that do this, they're seeking more like an 8% return, something more like you might get in the long run in the stock market if you take, you know, some risk in the stock market. And so they see that it's a very high degree of risk, so they only fund projects with a very high return, so that some of the time they get that, or they at least get close to it, so that in the aggregate they might get 8% return. You know, but there, because of that whole setup, it only funds the top of the market, you know, only funds, you know, the highest price units, usually for sale units, you know, where if everything went really well, it would get that very high return. So if we did, we do that, and if we did more market rate housing in that model, in that roughly like I'm describing, if we do more of that, and that is going to be a component of what happens in California, that can slow price increases, less of an auction. Again, I know this is missing some nuance about location and everything else. It's important, but you know, this helps soak up some of the demand, lowers price increases through the open market. But again, it just can't scale in that formulation. It can't scale to all the housing that we don't have and all the folks who can't afford housing today. Unfortunately, the problem's getting worse. You know, we would need by 2025, the deficit will be up to 3.5 million homes, it would seem, that we need to be creating to have the same amount of housing per capita that the rest of the United States has. There's different analysis, and they come up with 2 million, 4 million, or whatever, but picked one. And this analysis by McKinsey was in 2016, that there were 2 million units missing then. That goes up 180,000 units a year. Tragically, some have been burning down. We have population growth, you know, et cetera. And each year, so each one of those greenhouses is 100,000 housing units in my little chart here. If you take that scale, the blue little box is how much publicly funded affordable housing we build every year. That's how much market rate model housing we build every year. Maybe a little bit of that's inclusionary housing, but it's the market rate model. And so we're falling further behind every year. So again, we can do more to boost both those models, but neither of them is building housing for the majority of lower income households or any of the middle income households that's affordable. In broad strokes, nothing I say is quite 100% true. Okay, now at this point in the presentation, I try to take a deep breath, because again, my blood pressure goes up when I start talking about how big the problem is. So I don't have all the answers to what we can do that, and I certainly don't pretend to have all the answers. There's a lot of things we probably need to do, and there's a lot of great proposals out there. I'm just going to tell you about one thing I'm trying to do that I think is one thing that's needed. Creating a new system, simply put, what this system does is raises new private sources of funding for housing. So not trying to compete for those public dollars that are all already getting used and that we need more of. So finding other sources of funding that will take a lower return, build market rate, below market rate housing that's infill rental housing. So focusing on rental housing, that's what most people today can afford. And if they had affordable rental housing, they'd be more likely on a path to ownership. So focusing on rental housing, infill, that's below market rate in general, but also that maximizes affordability. I'll come back to that. And doing it in a way that's compatible with advancing environmental goals and racial equity and economic justice goals. So again, thinking carefully about how it's done so that it's advancing those things, not setting them back. So that doesn't sound too radical. Raise some money and build some housing and not charge too much for it and try to do it ethically. I mean, you know, yeah, we all know that's probably complicated, but it doesn't sound radical. But I'll put it another way, which is that, again, here's the housing rate model on just a couple points. First, affordability. Housing, the market rate model, we talked about a bunch last night, the inclusionary requirements. So we say many requirements for housing. One of them is some degree of affordability, a little bit of inclusionary housing that's a low income or very low income, more if you do bonus density, et cetera. But we got some affordability requirements in there. And that, along with a whole long other list of things, is something you check off. Okay, when you're planning it, you satisfy that requirement, great, put it on the shelf, you did it. And now you go through the whole project and it's a business. And in that business, you're always looking at profit. If you invest a little bit more, like was said last night, in the granite countertops, maybe you can sell the housing for more and get more profit. If you avoid doing this other thing, that it's your choice, then you save money and you get more profit. Okay, that's the business. If there's one thing I'm trying to do, it's New Way Homes flip that around and say, look, here's the profit is going to be something in the list of things we satisfy. We know how much it is. Ideally, it's quite modest, and say that's the profit. We set it at the beginning, we satisfy it, set it on the shelf. And then everything through the entire development process and management of the housing forever is looking at all kinds of choices from the lens of how do we maximize affordability. So if we just do that, that's what's led me down 6 years a road of coming up with other ways to do things. So one, again, a foundation is that lower cost of capital. So New Way Homes is a 501c3 nonprofit. I wanted to have a board. I wanted to have non-profit requirements attached to the money that underlies this housing development, so that, again, that mission can't get lost. So we tracked capital at 3 to 6% returns, and that funds the early stage project work. So what's often called pre-development, which means everything up through getting your building permit. So it's the design, it's the community engagement, the permits for planning, then the permits for building and construction drawings, and the work to get the rest of the capital, et cetera. So that's seen as the highest risk work. So that's what usually demands the highest return and what banks won't lend for, et cetera. So trying to do that with capital that takes a low return sets the stage toward a different development model and product. And to date, we've raised over $6 million for that pre-development fund. And again, if you know what it costs to build housing, that doesn't sound like a lot of money. But if that is just the pre-development money that's starting projects that then leverages all the construction money you get elsewhere, that actually adds up to quite a bit. And this fund is such that it funds that pre-development, then eventually that money comes back out of the project into the fund and can go into a new project. So it can be used over and over again. And just a few of the institutions that have funded this, or most of the institutions funded this, there's a few more, and 150 individuals so far, most of them in Santa Cruz County. So people investing in affordable housing in our own community. And I just have to just say one thing, which is if you go to newwayhomes.org, you can find this information. And our latest campaign there is on through WeFunder. So it's real easy for anyone to invest online. So if anyone's interested, please check it out or ask me questions. Or if you're actually interested in, we've uncovered a lot of the how do you legally allow community to invest in things in your own community that can work toward common goals. So if anybody wants to do that for other good causes, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to share what I've learned, trying to use crowdfunding and other funding vehicles to try to do this. And so then there's a whole bunch of techniques. I'm only going to focus on a couple of them that we've figured out through this. Just like I said, publicly funded affordable housing has a very complicated capital stack. It has to get money from a lot of different sources. Ours capital stack's pretty simple, but we often look at a much more complicated or nuanced rent level stack. So that's the income that's going to pay off the debt that is the majority of the construction cost. And so we look at saying, well, we need a certain amount of income to cover land costs if we had to buy the land, the debt and the operating costs, and that's what we need because we're paying a limited return to investors. And then we say, okay, what can we do with affordability under that? This is a pretty conservative stack. We usually do much better than that, but better than what's shown here. But I just want to show At a minimum, we always would do, of course, some very low income, some low income, usually more than this. And then maybe a little market rate if we have to. A lot of our projects don't have that, some have to. And then we look at everything in the middle and say, well, can it at least be somewhat below market rate? Can it become more below market rate over time? What can it be Section 8 rent level and preference people with vouchers, et cetera. So it's a whole bunch of things. We always use bonus density, preferencing some of those vouchers like I talked about. That's the one part of housing subsidy that goes unused in our community, is hundreds and hundreds of households who have vouchers today and nowhere to use them. So we really have to end that. And more environmental sustainability, because we look at 30-year costs of the housing, not just the construction costs. So we're trying to build some of the first passive house apartment building size passive house buildings in California. Transit oriented, we all hear if you can build less parking and make that legitimately work for people. We're looking at getting bus passes for people, subsidizing e-bike purchases, everything we can do to be more transit oriented, modular construction. And then land partnerships is turned out to be really key for us. A majority of our projects are partnering with nonprofits or other folks who are mission driven, or schools or whatever, who own land and want to build some very mission driven housing that seeks affordability, aligns with what we're doing. And if we don't have to pay for the land up front, there's more to work with. Okay, that all sounds great, but like, how does it actually come out? Well, here I want to show, our first 350 units we have in the development process. Roughly look like this, where the biggest slice is permanent supportive housing, so extremely low income for folks who've been chronically homeless with services. Then we have a little project up in Oakland. So we're working today in City of Santa Cruz, Salinas, and Oakland, and we're trying to work towards soon in Watsonville and Live Oak. But of the ones we have going already, so we have a project in Oakland that's reentry. Then we have some, traditionally deed restricted, very low income, deed restricted low income, moderate income. And then we have these categories where, I call this 21% below market rate, but with rent control. So we model that where it's like, okay, it might be somewhat of a discount off market rate today when it gets started, but we make sure, it's not going to go up more than 2 or 2.5%, per year on average in the long run. So it becomes more and more under market rate over time. And then we have about 10% of the units in these projects on average as potentially market rate. The big idea, okay, is that if we can do that, build projects, own pieces of those projects, or own those projects in this system, then the value and unrealized value, because we're renting below market rate, in these projects can back investment, and at which point it can become seen as low risk enough that we can get both this pre-development and construction dollars at 4, 6, even 8% rate of return, in a way that a much bigger class of investors who's not as psychologically invested in affordable housing in Santa Cruz County sees as a market rate, but positive for the world, but still about market rate risk adjusted return. That's what I think housing needs as a human right, as a basic human need. If we're going to produce enough housing, we have to provide publicly funded housing, and we have to provide housing that's privately funded that gets a modest return. It's the only way I see of doing it. And so I'm making one attempt here. Hopefully other people will make other attempts, but to see if we can build a system where then the billions of dollars see this type of work as a market rate return, because of the risk profile that's created. And so my big idea is to try to prove that can work, and then see lots of other people do it and have that become part of the industry. And then we could, stop rent from going up overall. This was kind of my little version of a chart that was up last night where, inflation adjusted rent over the decades in Santa Cruz, keeps going up and prices out people. And so, if we could have overall enough supply, that would stop going up. But then if we could actually achieve that supply by building a lot of under market rate housing for folks who are, performing all these jobs, et cetera. That would be a solution to the housing crisis if we're also doing it in an environmentally sustainable way that overcomes a lot of the racial injustice of the past with housing. So we have some small projects we started with. The one on the left is here in Santa Cruz, 801 River Street. It's now under construction, 7 units of permanent supportive housing. That's going to be owned by Housing Matters. We raised 100% of the financing for that project. And then this one on the right is a church in Oakland. It's a Black church, and they had a big vacant wing of the church. So we're renovating that into 12 units, which are going to be this reentry program with services. This left is this site we've been doing all the environmental work on, and now the site planning for in Salinas for 80 some units of housing. And another sketch of another church that we're working with. And then I want to mention real quick, we have this project in Santa Cruz, the permanent supportive housing project. And really excited about this one because that's the mindset I started with from the beginning, but it's taken years to get there. That's 120 units of permanent supportive housing, now has planning approval, and we're working on the construction drawings. Okay, I know I'm getting close on time, so I wanted to highlight a few other high-level points that I've learned. And a lot of this was not stuff that I started with thinking was true, and conclusions I've come to, and I've always adjusting. One is it's a tragedy of the commons in California with all the land use authority and local governments. Nobody wants to just start creating tons of housing in their city and become the bedroom community for everybody everywhere. Just try to soak up all of the demand regionally and not actually change the market in their own city. And so I definitely understand that, and it's why a lot of the solutions are statewide. And so now that a lot of that's happening, there are big statewide changes to make sure everywhere starts creating their fair share of housing at different income levels. We can't only look at ourselves. We've got to look at how we're a part of that bigger solution. And I'd be happy to talk more about that. I've really become a proponent of like, wow, there's no change option. We really more can price a lot of people out of this community, as has been happening, and we can make that a lot worse than it has been to date, or we can create a lot more housing density. We're certainly not going to sprawl, and so we have to build up in the areas we have developed already. And then I've really been re-examining my assumptions. I've come to the conclusion I don't think new housing actually induces demand here. It does increase population because it prevents displacement, but I don't consider that new demand. And really realized, wow, our residential water use has been going down for decades and projected to continue to go down even as we have more population, and we can actually do an even better job of that than we have, and building new housing to a very high standard can be a part of that. Last thing I'll say, this will be it, is exclusionary zoning. So this is mentioned again, this was the big theme of the talk last night, that we've made most kinds of housing illegal to build, especially this missing middle, small scale projects. And I've certainly learned that the brain damage you go through trying to do small projects is just as much as a big project. And we need to rectify that so we can get small scale development in our community. And that some really exciting things going on. We are a really segregated society and region, and single family home only zoning was literally invented to keep people of color out of white neighborhoods. One of the first places anywhere that did that was Berkeley. And a really exciting thing is that just yesterday, 4 members of Berkeley City Council started work to eliminate that in Berkeley. And so that's like a 100-year cycle of coming back out of this trend, and we've got a long ways to go. As you may know, Oregon has taken this step statewide and said, everywhere, can have at least duplexes, and a lot of places can have fourplexes, and there's a little nuance to it, but they've done that, and the state came within a hair's breadth of in California of doing that last year, and I hope does do it this year. There's details to be worked out, but I hope it does that. But in the meantime, Sacramento is doing it, Berkeley's just started, and I hope it's something we can tackle here in Santa Cruz as well. I said that was the last, but I do want to say we are going to be required to the state to do upzoning in the next few years, and we get to decide how, but just not whether we do it. And so I'm looking forward to the community process to figure out how we do it. So I'll stop there.
Well, great. Thank you, Sibley. Can you hear me, everyone?
Yes.
Jim Weller speaking here. Okay. What I'd like to do is give our panel of three about 8 or 9 minutes now, maybe a couple of minutes each, to ask Sibley any follow-up questions that come to mind about what he just said. And then we'll move into a series of pre-established questions that the organizers have provided. We'll spend about 40 minutes on that. And then after that, we'll open the discussion up to questions from the online audience. I'll tell you how to do that. Well, I'll tell you now. The online audience can ask questions using the Q&A feature. So at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A icon. Click on that. Do not use the chat box. Use the Q&A. Type in your questions there. And when the time comes, I will pose those questions to the panelists. So let's go with the panelists and follow up with Sibley's presentation for a few minutes. And then we'll.
Jim, can I also ask a question?
Yes.
Thank you. I'll be last, and I'd love to ask a question too. Thank you.
Okay. So go.
Who first?
I'll go first if it's okay. So Sibley, I have actually two questions for you. The first one is, in your model, in the model that you describe, in terms of, and it makes complete sense to look at new capital vehicles to invest. But when we look at race and racial equity and the wage gaps, how, other than the volume of affordable units, are you addressing the racial equity issues that you mentioned in the beginning? So that's my first question. I'll come back to the second one after that.
Yeah. So the yes, one of them is just having more affordable units, but another is in where we're developing in communities that are communities of color. We're doing it through a partnership model. So that's where, for example, I started work in Oakland because I met a pastor there who'd been connected to many churches for decades, and so he introduced me to a lot of churches, and those are Black churches, and we are letting them take the lead on who is this housing for, how's it managed, what is the needs of the community that they serve, et cetera. And we're working with other nonprofits as well, not just churches. And so we're really making an effort there to be an enabler to create the housing they envision, and to serve the needs that they're seeking to serve, rather than trying to purchase a site and totally control the project.
And then I'll ask a second question, and then I'll let my fellow panelists ask. There's a lot of conversations going on about, in essence, what's universal commons, whether it's through the land trust discussion or ways that the public can own, the properties themselves. That's a little different in a nonprofit. It's different. It's more aligned to public housing, but this includes like the middle income bracket. What are your thoughts in terms of that kind of universal commons approach or ownership of assets from the community in terms of housing?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's 100 strategies. We should be pursuing so many of them, and it's a big, it's a big effort to get, big things going in that direction. And I think we should do it. I think a couple, just because I mostly know what I work on, a couple things I'll mention that I hadn't yet said. I guess a lot of these partnerships we have with nonprofits serving the community, whether it's Housing Matters working on homelessness in Santa Cruz, or it's organizations led by people of color in their own communities serving other needs. We often pursue a model where in the long run, certainly they have equity stake in the projects, and those organizations do. And in the long run, we're trying to get the projects entirely owned by those organizations. So we try to create a model where we can do that over time. And then also, even in the buildings themselves, I've been looking at setting for a lot of our apartment buildings trying to allow tenants to earn ownership shares over time. I could talk a lot about that, but trying to set up, a way to do that for a slice of ownership. That's different than some of the other models you're talking about, which I also think are fantastic, just haven't been what I've dived into.
Thanks, Sibley. Next.
You're going to have to appoint them, Jim.
Did you have a question, Erica?
I do, but I wanted to yes, I do have. Sibley, thank you for that presentation. It was genius. Thank you. I wanted to ask you if you can tell us where at the City Council and City Management Santa Cruz is for changing the single family zoning.
I don't know that that's been looked at. I
At all.
absolutely could be missing that, but I don't know that that's, I don't know of any effort to really consider that. That said, what I was alluding to at the very end, I think that will get prompted because what I alluded to at the very end is this, regional housing needs assessment cycle. It's very wonky, but we're going to get a assignment from the state, in the next year or so that says we have to zone for a certain number of additional units of housing at different income levels. And we're going to have to decide how we accomplish that. And surely some of that could be upzoning, expanding some area of downtown, which has started, the south of Laurel discussion of zoning some more. I think there's a lot of sense in that. But, the already created statewide ability to create ADUs, will be factored in as well. But we're going to have to do more than that, I strongly suspect. And so I think that is one option that we should look at to accomplish that.
Thank you.
Sibley, thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask you a little bit more. You just touched on the more density as one of the choices. The other choice is to become an enclave for wealthy, high-tech people who commute or don't even have to commute over the hill. So tell us more about density and how we can help our neighbors come to grips with that as a solution.
Wow. I wish I had the perfect answer to that. I think, there's a couple things. I mean, I think one is the theme of last night, and what I was just talking about is about, legalizing smaller scale developments. I think, it is one of the most contentious things is when big developments are happening near somebody, right? And it seems like such a huge sudden change. Well, we probably need to do some of those, but also I think we need to meet a lot of this capacity. Now, that said, I mean, small scale developments where people are adding 4 units or 9 units in the few places that's legal in Santa Cruz get a lot of pushback from neighborhoods, a lot as well. So I think that's part of, I hope, Housing Santa Cruz County, from an affordable housing point of view. And I think we need to contribute to organized efforts to really campaign out there so that it isn't only like, development coming and trying to get approval for something when something gets argued about. I think we should put this positive spin on it, like help everyone who's contributing to our community continue to live here, have the creative diversity that Santa Cruz has long had, things that we're proud of, I think, and that define Santa Cruz. And we should be saying, like, look, we have a vision for allowing that to continue, and here's how we connect the dots. That's the best thing I can think of. And I've taken the other thing is, if everybody would take Sandy Leiden's Cabrillo College classes on Santa Cruz history, then you realize that since the gold rush, Santa Cruz has been gradually changing, and it's going to keep gradually changing. There's and I was astonished seeing in the 1890s newspaper articles that were like, stop changing Santa Cruz. And so I think we just have to keep having those conversations, but talk about the positives side of it.
I wonder if I could ask some questions and maybe make a couple of points, because I think one of the things that you said, Sibley, that I thought was very true is that market rate housing doesn't respond to the affordable housing crisis very much. And the notion that we're going to have unlimited density, which it's sounding like you're supporting, is not going to do very much for affordable housing. And the image that was presented last night of musical chairs, I thought was a really good one. You know, you're playing musical chairs, you have so many chairs and so many people. If you don't, you know, the richest get the chairs. Well, you can increase the number of chairs, but if you're also increasing the number of people, you're not really changing anything. And if the chairs are only available for the rich people, you're really not changing anything. We get demand from university growth. We get demand from the high-tech workers from the Silicon Valley. Simply using our scarce land, or let me put it into a question, how can we maximize affordable housing in those areas where somewhat higher density is desirable, when in fact we're just allowing, we're really allowing mostly market rate housing. There are some affordable housing projects and they're great, and the city is pursuing them. But the majority of what's being proposed, the city has 1,400 projects in the pipeline. So I think it's sort of reconciling this notion that somehow lots of density is going to do much with affordable housing is very questionable. And it seemed consistent with what you started out saying, although it sounded like you changed your mind by the time you reached the end.
No, it's the nuance. I mean, it's the yes and. It's the that look, if we were only talking about Santa Cruz, and Santa Cruz, you know, and there's no way we're going to have, you know, quote unquote unlimited density for sure. But you know, if we were only talking upzoning in Santa Cruz, like, yeah, it's just going to soak up demand, you know, from around the area to a certain extent. But what I think is smart that's being done is that that is happening statewide. So, you know, Silicon Valley is being made to do it a couple years ahead of us, and so there's, you know, zoning has to increase in the Bay Area enough to make it realistic that 441,000 more units of housing are going to be created in this next 8 years. And that's the number. That's the best thing for the Santa Cruz housing market that I've ever heard, right? Because that's where the biggest job growth is. And in fact, the jurisdiction that has to grow the most out of that, 35% of that housing, is in Santa Clara County. Is all the jurisdictions within Santa Clara County. So, you know, having that big job engine over the hill from us finally start creating housing at or beyond the pace in which it creates jobs, you know, again, that's not even our policy, and that's the best thing that has to happen. But a part of that is that we have to also proportionally zone for some more density as well. So all I'm saying is, you know, it's just a fact. We, you know, to get that benefit over the hill, we have to do our fair share too, and we're going to be made to do it, and we, you know, we have to find a good way to do it. Now, and so yes, I do think, you know, I think the sources of demand you talk about have been gradual. They're constant pressure, and we've been building very little housing, you know, over 40 years, in my view. I mean, whether you call it very little or not is subjective, but I think it's, compared to demand, it's been lower than those gradual sources of demand. And so they've been piling up. And so we have that game of musical chairs. So I think we need to do both. I think, yes, we need to create some more, including market rate housing, to soak up that gradual demand. But the other problem is, as you know, that's most of what we've done. So it shouldn't be most of what we do. It just also does need to happen. So how can we do better? That was your other part, is that, you know, I think we could have even more, you know, of a bonus density ordinance here than we have to. You know, we essentially have the state law because everywhere has to have that, but the state law allows, you know, more of a bonus density ordinance, and I think we could do that. I also think, so the last thing I'll say on this, because I could talk for half an hour just on that, on the question you posed, is that in my view, we set all these rules for housing, and I can say, you know, it is incredibly difficult to build housing here. Even if, you know, I mean, it's incredibly difficult. And we set all these rules, and then at the end of the day say, well, we should get more inclusionary out of it. And so we fight about what that inclusionary percentage is. And I think we should reverse that. I think it's another thing where we should be flipping the script and say, look, a lot of these things in these rules are important. Trying to fund hardening our water infrastructure for the whole community because of climate change is an important thing to do, but is charging every new housing unit, even though we don't charge, current rate holders for that project, more important than getting more affordable housing? I think there's a bunch of stuff we do in our process and in our costs and in our rules that are, to me, not as important as more affordable housing. Not that they're not important at all, and not that they should be eliminated entirely. So I think if we really made a big effort and went through everything that we require of housing and allowed smaller scale projects, I think we could get more affordable housing out of projects that we build.
Well, let me just say that the city does have fee waivers for affordable housing. It's the market rate housing that I think you're talking about, and that what I'm hearing is, how are you reconciling your desire for more housing, quote, just as housing, doubling or increasing the density bonus, for example? How do you reconcile that with environmental sustainability or maintaining a quality of life? When I was thinking of that musical chairs analogy, it was sort of like, yeah, you're bringing more chairs, you're bringing more people, and then nobody wants to play the game anymore because it's too unpleasant trying to find some place to be. So,
Well, if
I
there's
mean, I
somebody who
think
wants
that,
to live in it's always been true in Santa Cruz, somebody who wants to live in a really small town that's the size Santa Cruz used to be 50 years ago, this is where they're going to live. There's a lot of people who love the size Santa Cruz is and will love it when it's 20% bigger than it is. I mean, I think, there's tons of things we can do to keep making Santa Cruz a better place to live. We have our big problems and challenges. But to me, having, somewhat more housing units, is not the problem. I mean, I would enjoy living around that if it means we can continue to have great diversity in our community. So to me, that's, it's the people getting priced out are the things we're losing. To me, having some more taller buildings or some modest more, fourplexes mixed in with single family homes, to me, that's not a big change for the things, but again, I respect everybody's differences on that. And that's the conversation we have in the community, but we have those choices.
but would you agree that what we're not talking about absolutes here? We're
Yes.
not talking about, on the one hand, no development at all, or sort of overwhelming development. What we're talking about is trying to find a balance between providing, maintaining sort of a desirable community, however you want to define it, and providing housing for a diverse community. And, the question is, how much is too much? When can there be consideration for people who live here as well as for people who want to live here? And from my particular, and given your basic value of how can we assure that the housing that's being provided is going to help meet the need for those who have the hardest time affording it. And that, I think the city has upzoned significantly in the last general plan. That's why there's such a big fight about the corridor zoning. That's why there's a big fight on the east side around even relatively small developments, because they're not single family zoning anymore. They're multifamily zoning next to single family homes. And that's what the problem is. In my view, what's really going to make a huge difference converting our community is the accessory dwelling unit law. It is very, very lenient, as you know, and essentially allows for at least the doubling of density, and could have a much greater effect than allowing duplexes, although I think even duplexes are allowed in single family zones. So some of the recent changes in state law, which reduce the city's discretion and allow for greater provision of ADUs, really, I think, make big steps in the direction you're advocating, which is allowing for more moderate income housing, which I think is key. But my concern is trying to have some kind of balance between the scale of new development and assuring that if we're going to give up what's very limited land inside the urbanized area, there really needs to be that commitment to affordability. Let me say one more thing about what you said about vouchers, because I'm on the Housing Authority Board, and I think there's a strong misconception in the community that there are all these people with vouchers running around. That is really not the case. There are 12,000 people on the waiting list, but the Housing Authority doesn't have enough vouchers for everybody on the waiting list. The Housing Authority has about almost 5,000 vouchers, and only about 200 people at any one time are running around trying to find a place to live. The Housing Authority has been very successful housing people with their, it's been about 95% of the people who have vouchers were able to find housing. So that's one thing. The other thing, which really supports—
That's why I said hundreds. I think I was accurately portraying that. You know, there's a few hundred more that are using them for a smaller size unit than they're allowed to get. So they're
right, and there are,
overcrowded,
but there are 4,700 who have found housing.
Yep.
The other thing that I think supports what you're saying is that there's been a recent study from the U.S. Census of our housing market, and it found that the federal subsidy on a Section 8 voucher is almost $1,300 a month. So you start to add up what that means in terms of the cost of providing housing for very low income people. And, you know, it's not surprising that what you came up with for the state of $1 trillion is realistic. But in terms of really getting housing for that level of people with that level of income, there has to be that subsidy. The market is just not going to be capable of doing it.
Okay.
So I'm sorry it took so much time.
Thanks, Andy. We're going to get back to questions about housing authority and vouchers. We have a list of questions that were presented by some of the organizers of this conference. I'll start off with the one which could be the most controversial. You don't have to respond at length about this, but the question is, what part could rent control play in increasing opportunities for affordable housing? Who would like to address that?
Based on the silence, I'll go ahead and start, Jim. You know, I think rent control is part of, and it's not sufficient. When we're looking at it specifically for our Santa Cruz, the city of Santa Cruz, the mix of housing that we have and the current laws that we have in place and the legislation that we have in place means that if we cannot address the single family housing that we have in abundance in the city, any rent control measure that doesn't address that is not going to create enough of an impact to really have an impetus on the affordability in the city. So I think there's work to be done in Sacramento to look at what we can do to facilitate some of that. But again, it is not sufficient in the sense that we got to be thinking about the future of our city and how we're going to move forward. What about our children and grandchildren? Where would they live if they're, in essence, is capped out of access to housing? So I do think that it is a complex question, just like housing is complex, but it is talking about in an equitable way, really about how we're going to develop the new housing that we need to ensure that people who make Santa Cruz possible can be here. And how do we ensure then that the future generations can still live in the area? And whatever solution may be in terms of rent caps or however you want to phrase it, needs to look at the makeup of the housing mix and capture the single family housing.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to have a whack at that?
Well, I'm happy to say something about it because I think, you know, rent control has been on the ballot in Santa Cruz a number of times. It's always failed, either by a little or by a lot. It's always been very controversial. I agree with Maria that having rent control of single family homes would be a big difference. But I think because there are so many one or two single family homes that are rented, and we have so many small landlords, it's very, very difficult to convince a majority of people to support rent control. So my sense is, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen at the state level. And the state has already taken some steps to at least prevent excessive rent increases. But I think I just don't see how politically it's going to be possible to get some meaningful rent control passed with the possibility of a referendum every time it comes forward.
Eva has raised her hand. she's going to need a little bit of a breather because we're going too fast in our speaking.
I'm sorry, that's always my problem.
Me too. I'm a machine gun when I talk.
Okay, anyone else before we move on? Hearing none. The next several questions have to do with housing authority programs and housing choice vouchers. So the first one is explain the role of the voucher program in making market rate housing affordable to low income families.
Thank you. One of the things that we want people to understand is that housing choice vouchers can be used with people who are working and are making up to as much as 80% of the area median income. So most of the people we serve with the vouchers are extremely low income or very low income, but they can be, some number can be just low income, moderately low income. That's important to understand because there's a lot of ideas that it's that Section 8, as people think of it, is only for people that are extremely low income. So we can use vouchers to help people that have income be able to meet the cost of market rate rentals. And one of the things that we've most recently done is Executive Director Jenny Panetta with the Board of Commissioners rejected the fair market rent that HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, assigned us, and because it was too low. It was the only decrease in the region, and we know rent is a regional issue. So we conducted a study, our own independent study, and had accepted that, and that increased our fair market rents, which allows us to increase our payment standards, the amount that the housing authority can contribute toward the rent. And so it allowed more people to be able to search and find more units, that more units were then available to them because of that increased payment standard. They had more choices.
Thank you, Ellen. Anyone else? All right, the next question is, can you tell us how the Housing Authority and local developers are using federally funded vouchers to support development of new affordable housing? These project-based—
I think Sibley mentioned this a little bit when he put some of the housing developers, the nonprofit housing developers, Mid-Penn, Eden Housing, Chispa, up on the screen. We work with all of those housing developers. They request that we set aside some of our housing choice vouchers to be project-based, which means the assistance stays with the units. I like to think of this as guaranteeing the rent for 15 years. The housing developer can basically factor that in, pencil that into their equation, that for the units that they're going to project base, they know that we are going to be able to pay up to our payment standard every month, regardless of what happens to the tenant's income. You know, like last year, we saw all these people lose their jobs, lose their hours. We just were able to pay more. So the landlords didn't suffer through that. We have a number of projects in development, but one of the ones I want to get people to think about is St. Stephen's Senior Housing right here on Soquel Avenue. That's a great example of a very strong collaboration with the City of Santa Cruz, the County of Santa Cruz, Mid-Penn Housing, and the Housing Authority. It's a 40-unit complex. It's 3 stories tall. It's all for low-income seniors. 39 of those units, 1 unit is for the manager. But that is an example of, we committed to project-based the entire complex, all the units, so except for the managers. But that is stable housing for low-income seniors and stable for our neighborhood, for our communities. and a good use of land that was, the church wasn't using it. So really good use of limited land, and we hope to see more of those.
Could I add something here? The housing choice voucher that Ellen is describing is really a powerful tool. It does have its limits, and so far as she indicated, it's really being used by nonprofit developers for nonprofit housing. The program allows up to 25% of the units in a new family development to have project-based vouchers. And as Ellen indicated, in a senior development, it can be 100%. However, it requires that the construction of the housing be with prevailing wages. And prevailing wages for market rate developers, and this speaks to some of the points that Sibley was raising, can have a significant increase on construction costs. So market rate developers are less likely to want, so far haven't really wanted project-based vouchers because they don't want to have the construction costs. That doesn't prevent them from making their units available to Section 8 tenants using the mainstream vouchers. The payment would be about the same, but if the tenant decides to leave, there goes the Section 8 subsidy. So the benefit, as Ellen said, with the project-based vouchers is that they stay with the unit for 15 years. But it is a limit that it really hasn't been found very workable by private market rate developments. If I've got that right, Ellen, you can correct me if I've got that wrong.
You're right about the prevailing wages. The economic justice person in me says, of course, they should be paying prevailing wages in construction. So we're glad that that's part of the requirement from HUD. And it is, if they're over 9 units, they do have to pay prevailing wages, 9 or more units.
I'm not arguing against it. I'm just saying that that's a reason why it's not being used for market rate projects.
Yeah, right. It's a pay now or pay later. So we actually think, the value of the project-based voucher, because it can be 15 years, is a significant factor in the equation. It doesn't help the upfront costs, though. You're right.
Well, it may, because it could really help getting financing. I spoke to the developer of the project on Water Street, and that was opened up not that long ago. And he said it would not have been possible for him to get the financing to build the project if he hadn't been able to get the project-based vouchers based on the number of disabled people and other low-income people in that development.
It does provide a real stability to the financial picture.
Sibley, can you quickly define that term, prevailing wage rate, and how it affects projects, multifamily projects that you've worked on?
Yeah, so it's a calculation to pay certain wages for each function in the on-site construction work on a project, and that can cost 10 to 30%. That can cause an increase of 10 to 30% in a total project cost from a variety of variables, because it's not that prevailing wage rate depends on where you are in the state of California, and depends on all the nature of the project. So there's a cost increase, in that range generally for projects. The thing where I find it, there are some big projects that do take it on and just pay prevailing wage, and that's great. But where I find it the hardest is in small projects, because it's not so much that price increase per se, but most smaller contractors in Santa Cruz, for example, just aren't set up with the significant compliance you have to do, the paperwork. I've been a part of projects that have taken, for nonprofit construction projects, that have taken a year longer just to find anyone who will do a small project, because the big companies are set up to do that and don't want a small project, and the small companies don't want to do it, and they're all busy with other projects where they don't have to go through that. just a real hassle. So it is an effect. Of course, I would love to pay high wages and everything we do, but we have to, figure out making everything work. So.
I'd like to ask a question to you, Sibley and Andy, maybe, that I have heard the number that to build one unit, it costs $400,000. That seems crazy to me. And I'd like to know, where that comes, how that cost breaks down to that amount.
Well, literally, you're going to pay, $300 to $350 a square foot just for the hard construction costs in most projects across a range of project sizes. So, it depends on the sizes of the unit and all the details of the project, how much, and that's just that. And then you got land costs, you got, for a mixed income project, most of what we do, the fees to the city and schools and everything else are actually usually more than we're paying for land. So big costs there. And then you got a long process, going through, and lots of other soft costs and financing costs, which are expensive too. So, you add all that up, and yeah, that's the reality. Now, I will say we're our big permanent supportive housing project we talked about, that's all small studios. And so even though there's a whole floor of services space with a clinic, all kinds of stuff, we're looking at just over $200,000 a unit for that, for total project costs for the whole project, including financing costs and everything. We could only do that because we're privately funded, but we're looking at that. And I've built an ADU of about the same size, very small studio ADU that was about the same, $200,000. Most ADUs are a little bigger, a little bit more. That's like the very bottom end. And it's still astonishing to me, that things are just so expensive to build here that even the smallest units, cost $200,000. So if you're doing a, 3-bedroom unit in an affordable housing building, it's going to be probably $500,000 in Santa Cruz County.
Okay. Before we go on, I want to say to the people who are posting questions in the chat function, don't do that. I'm not going to look at those questions. You need to post your questions in the Q&A function. And so we'll go on here. Let's move on to some questions about ADUs. Sibley just mentioned an ADU. Here's one question. There are thousands of homes, garages, and backyards in Santa Cruz County that could accommodate affordable accessory dwelling units, which would go a long way toward addressing our local housing needs and at a much lower cost than infill housing developments. Would it be possible to create a program that assists homeowners in financing, building, and renting out ADUs and makes it easy to do so? It's open to anyone.
Because the state has removed a lot of the barriers to ADU construction, it's by right, just a building permit, not a planning permit. There's not a additional parking requirement and stuff. Now, we heard last night, people are saying there's still some barriers in Santa Cruz. That's probably true. We need to keep going through the cycle of saying, well, what's preventing that people from wanting to have ADUs from actually getting them done? Are there any of those barriers we can take down? But the bulk of it has been taken down. The biggest, hardest thing I see and hear about that remains is the financing. And so, if you don't have a lot of equity in your home, then, the getting an increase in your mortgage or a second mortgage and still leaving some equity in your home as a bank would require is not feasible. And so there's a lot of people who don't qualify to borrow an extra $250,000, $300,000 to build an ADU and still have equity in their home to satisfy a bank. The ADU will pay for itself. You rent it out, you can pay that back, but normal home mortgage lenders don't look at it that way. They just lending you a ratio of the value of your home as it is now. So then you got to take out your mortgage with a construction loan, so then you have actually a really big construction loan, it could be $1 million or something because it's taking out your mortgage plus the ADU costs. And then when you get the ADU built, you got to pay off that construction loan with a new mortgage, and you end up with a lot of fees. And it's difficult and expensive. So if we could crack that somehow, and I know there are efforts in other parts of the state, I'm not as familiar with them, if we could convene, some of our more locally focused banks and credit unions and CDFIs and have them do it, or do something through, county, city also, again, you don't want to trigger prevailing wage and other related requirements on such a small project. It gets very difficult to execute, but, if we could do that, that would really help.
So I'll just add that an ADU is a part of, but it's not deed restricted, right? So in terms of affordability in the long term, we're not solving the puzzle here. We're just kicking the can down the road. So unless we can develop some deed restrictions around affordability for the ADU issues, it's not necessarily the solution that will solve. There's no magic bullet. So I think I want to be cognizant of how the question was phrased a little bit, to make sure that we address that, and that we're really looking at, I'll go back to the three issues that you talked about, Sibley, and we talk about the wealth gaps and we talk about racial equity. The fact is that we have not invested in affordable housing in the city of Santa Cruz for decades. So we need to make up and not only build forward for the gaps that are there, but it takes time and it takes capital. So one of the things that I like about the New Way homes is that looking at a new way of building capital and providing that. But we also have to be working, I think, at the state level to look at what other kind of vehicles, what other kind of innovative platforms can we use to facilitate capital access, whether it's a small project or a larger project, without giving up living wages for the workers or make it possible. We cannot solve one issue and continue to bombard inequity by creating lower paying jobs. I'm not saying that it's easy, but I think that if we learn anything through this pandemic is the intersection and the connection between all of these issues. And we cannot continue to rely on low wage labor to lift us up to the inequities that we're currently living.
Thank you. Erica, are you saying it's time to take a break?
No, I was applauding Maria's comment.
Okay.
I think it's very it's very important to make a connection with housing and wages, living wages.
Okay, we
Could
have.
I add something here in terms of that sort of deed restriction question? I think it's a really good issue. The county did try a program of offering loans if homeowners would be willing to restrict their rents until the loan was paid off. And there was never much interest in it at all. And I'm not sure that was ever done because people want to be able to sort of control their own property. And I think the other side of that is that while certainly the ADU will be cheaper than a new market rate unit in a single family home, probably, the recent analysis that the city staff did was that they're really not what we would consider affordable necessarily, that the rents in ADUs tend to mimic what the market is charging for a unit of the same size, at least. So I think the point about deed restriction and how that's how you really assure affordability is really a good one. And I don't know whether there are very many ADUs Section 8 tenants are living. I think that would be an interesting thing to find out, because I think it is for smaller Section 8 clients, it could be a good resource. And of course, let me just say that the city and the county are rife with illegal ADUs. So the ease with legalizing them is going to have I think a positive effect on less expensive housing, but it's not going to solve it. And let me also say that I wear a number of hats, but I'm only participating in this conference as an individual.
Okay, Andy, thank you. Erica, when should we take a break?
We should take, and it's just 3 minutes because that's the time it takes for me to get the mile to the bathroom and back. So I think about 3 minutes just before you start the audience question and answer. Last night, we ran out of time and we couldn't address all the questions that the audience had, and it was a shame. And we, in fact, have 3 that we want to address tonight that were better suited for tonight's panel. So you decide, Jim. I don't know. It's 5:20. If we take a break now and go to the audience question, I think that we have a good balance. What do you think?
Okay, well,
Oh, and one more thing, Jim, when we have the break, could you please mute yourselves? Because yesterday, our audience had the pleasure of hearing someone discuss what they were going to have for dinner during the break. So make sure to mute yourselves, please.
okay, I will. We have a couple more questions having to do with ways that multifamily housing projects can be developed. Sibley addressed one of them to start with, but let's ask this one. Clearly, the only way to achieve 100% affordability for low to moderate income residents in a local multifamily housing development is with near total public or private nonprofit subsidies, or a combination of both. How can the pool of public capital available for such projects be very much increased locally?
I would think that I'm going to take the question as if it's a little different than stated, because I am looking at trying to do some projects that are 100% low and moderate income, housing projects without any public subsidy, where they're 80% low income, 20% moderate income. So, our income levels are at the place that sometimes that can work. So, it's a little different. But if we said very low and low income, then the premise of the question is 100% correct. So it's a worthy question. I don't think we have mechanisms or the political capability of creating them to dramatically fund that just locally. I think we need some money locally so that those can be matching funds. And then the state needs to keep increasing funding, and the federal government needs to keep increasing funding. And one of the most exciting things that was in Biden's housing plan that I think would have taken a stronger Senate majority to enact was making the housing choice voucher program, or something very similar to it, an entitlement, so that everybody who's eligible for it would actually get that. We'd still need the housing units, but that would have been a dramatic way to help create that. So I think that's at least being talked about, which would be a huge tectonic shift. That is at least being talked about for the first time in a long time in a more serious political way.
I'm so glad you said that. I would just want to echo that the National Association of Housing and Development Officials estimate that 1 in 5 eligible households in our country actually has a voucher. So 20% of the families that are struggling that could benefit from housing assistance, just 1 in 5 have it. And that's similar to what we experience here in Santa Cruz County. We see a significant number just through the census that would be eligible for the voucher, but we're limited by the amount that comes from the federal government to us.
I would just say that what the question really points out is that the problem of putting housing for very low income people cannot be solved locally. The city government and the county government don't have the resources. They don't have the ability to raise the taxes necessary to subsidize it. Even the tax measure that recently failed, if it had passed, it would have helped a great deal. It wouldn't have solved the problem. When you're talking about the possibility of $1,300 a month per unit forever, you get a sense of the scale. So I think what others have said is absolutely right. If the problem is going to be dealt with in a significant way, there has to be more money coming from the state and the federal government, because they have the ability to provide that subsidy that the local governments just do not have. I agree with Sibley. Local governments can provide some funding to leverage, but it's never going to be enough to make projects happen.
But I would say that our local government could do a better job than what they're doing. We could get a lot more if they were more willing to look for affordable housing and to accept a higher percentage of affordable housing than they are.
Well, let me just say, you know, the local government doesn't produce the housing. It's developers like Sibley or nonprofits that produce the housing. And in my experience, when nonprofits come forward with a project in the city and the county, they get support. They get pre-development money and they get support in trying to find long-term financing. There's a problem finding sites. There's a problem finding potential subsidies that could be brought to bear. The city is currently pursuing 3 low-income projects now that are going to be 100% affordable projects in the downtown. I have my criticisms of what the city does, but I think the attempt to get affordable projects through when they're brought forward is pretty standard.
So then I think we can look, that's what Housing Santa Cruz County is going to do, is try to look forward and see, you know, what else can we do? And it is that, you know, adding to the political will. Obviously Measure H, you know, countywide failed a few years ago. So adding to the political will to say, how can we find a different ongoing funding mechanism to get matching funding so that those projects that Andy's talking about, you know, get funded faster and they have an easier time getting their funding so they get executed. And then looking at more public land, as some of those that you're referring to are even on city-owned land, for example, but in the county and in Watsonville and in the city, you know, more sites. So, you know, I think I completely agree with Andy just said. I don't think the government's been resistant to 100% affordable projects. I think there are even more things we can do to try to get even more of our fair share of that funding here.
Good.
And I would suggest that the private sector could contribute as well. I think of Housing Santa Cruz County also looks at setting up a countywide housing trust that goes to private companies and ask them to contribute, as they're doing in Silicon Valley and with the Silicon Valley Housing Trust. I think we have enough of a need to justify such a trust here. And I hope that Housing Santa Cruz County does move in that direction, because I think there are resources that it's not just the community support, it's the dollars that need to be raised. And some of these big companies have the dollars that, if they were willing, they could make available, and they have their employees here.
Jim, yeah.
All right, thank you. Those are both very forward-looking answers. We're going to take a bio break now for 3 minutes. I'm going to mute myself, and when I come back, we'll start going through the audience questions. All right. We have a question here that is interesting. This says, in our area, with a housing jobs imbalance, should we shift our city emphasis from economic development, i.e. attracting employers, to housing development? Who would like to take that one on?
I don't think it's about choosing which chair we're sitting on at which given time. Economic development is complicated, and quite frankly, we have to look at the assumptions that we made about how we want to develop the city and the employment base that we have in the city. That's complex enough, but we do need to worry about ensuring housing fit. So however we're doing our housing development, to ensuring that it's meeting the housing needs of the workforce that we have and the workforce that we're looking to attract. You know, when we're looking at the current workforce that has predominantly relied on hospitality and services, you can see the devastating impact it has in overcrowded housing that we've seen, because there's not enough housing that is affordable for them. And given the jobs that they have that are not prevailing living wages for the city, it continues to build problems in the region. If we're looking at developing into different industries, whether it is in the past it's been talked as tech, then you end up with a workforce mismatch because the workforce that we have in the city doesn't have the education or the training for those tech jobs because they're predominantly service and hospitality workers. So then you end up displacing those hospitality and creating those continued wealth and racial gaps that we see in the area. So I don't think it's as easy as saying, let's move from this bucket to this other bucket. They both need to work, but we have to be much more thoughtful about the housing fit, the workforce development that we're looking at in the area. And in terms of economic development, I do think we need to be looking at how do we look regionally and attract different type of employers into Santa Cruz that align with the values of the city.
Okay,
Let
thank you.
me, I'd like to talk about the biggest the biggest employer in the county, and certainly the biggest employer in the city is the University of California, and it's at the Santa Cruz campus. Santa Cruz campus probably represents about 35% of the city's population. They are now going through a planning process to adopt a new, what they call long-range development plan, which is really very similar to the city's general plan. And they're proposing to add 8,500 students. There's a recognition that the university growth has already had massive impact or major impact. It's a current driver of our housing, the housing crisis that we have and the affordable housing crisis that we have. And while they have an objective of housing those new students and up to 25% of their new employees on campus, it's simply an objective. There's nothing in the long-range development plan or the draft environmental impact report that's currently circulating for public comment that requires them to do so. And in the past, when they've had very laudatory goals, they have not met them. So I think, you know, in terms of having an effective response to the, you know, a major driver of housing prices in the city, it's really critical to try to put pressure on the university, which is not subject to local land use control, to provide the housing for their campus growth on the campus. So it isn't increasing the demand for housing and not increasing the supply.
Thank you, Andy. Another question is this. We're under AMBAG, the Association of Monterey Bay Area Governments. AMBAG currently has the regional housing RHNA plan for 2014 to 2023. And how close is the city of Santa Cruz to meeting its allocations for the 2014 to 2023 period? In other words, how much housing would need to be produced if we were to meet those goals?
Well, the city is doing very well meeting the goal for higher income housing. It's not doing very well meeting the goal for affordable housing. And one of the problems with the whole housing needs process is it defines the housing need based on density. So it says that Santa Cruz needs, I don't remember how many units of affordable housing, but the way it defines that is that this and the city's requirement to provide for that housing is that they have to zone the city. Since the city doesn't build housing, it has to zone, have the general plan allocating enough land for that housing, but there's no requirement that that housing be affordable. So what happens is the city and the county have to zone land at higher density, but in fact, since there isn't enough subsidy or there aren't enough nonprofit developers to pursue projects at the higher density for affordable housing, what results, in my view, is an overabundance of market rate housing that meets the market rate housing demand, which is based on income, but not the affordable housing demand based on density. It's unfortunately, it's complicated. It's also important to know that the numbers really come from the state. They're based on statewide projections of what housing demand will be. And the State Department of Housing and Community Development somehow figures out how much of that demand should go to each region. And then the regional agencies like AMBAG distribute the demand to the various jurisdictions within their region. And they're now starting to work on the next housing element from 2023, I think, to 2030. I think there's 2029. I think there's 6-year housing element demands.
It's 8, yeah. I got some of the numbers in front of me. I can add to that. So actually, historically, we have not been meeting those goals, or we didn't even, do the housing element at one point, but then, we were not meeting. But in this last cycle, it's about permitting. So as Andy's saying, the city doesn't build housing, it permits housing. So it has enough housing projects come up, and then the city's approved them, and we are actually meeting the goals for this cycle. So even just through 2019, 2015 through 2019, those 5 years, we permitted housing to meet the RENA requirements in all of the income levels except for very low. So we'd done it in low income, moderate income, and above moderate income. That was kind of new because finally, housing was getting approved. A lot of that's not built yet, so there's a big leg time, for some of this. But there was still 156 units in the target for the very low income. Fortunately, did just approve this project I'm working on. It's 120 units. It's all very low income, so we'll knock down a big chunk of that. So we're kind of getting there. We're on the path to get there for the RENA goal in this cycle. The goal is going to be much bigger in last cycle because I won't go way into how it's created, but it was pretty modest from the point of view of how it was done statewide and then allocated to us. And those numbers are a lot bigger. Could be the next goal could be twice for the next 8 years, could be twice, for example, what it was the last 8 years. That was true for the entire Bay Area. It was like 2.5 times.
Well, thank you, Sibley. That's positive.
And I think, again, what the city will have to do is assure that there's enough land available at a density that would allow developers to meet those goals. There's no requirement that the city provide the housing because it can't, or that that only housing that serves affordable is acceptable. If it meets all the city has to do is have enough land or a zone that is at a density that is felt. And I think it used to be, Sibley, you can correct me, 20 units an acre is considered adequate for affordable housing.
Yeah, but something you and I totally agree on, Andy, is that it's a part of a system, and that's great. It's really important that these goals are set, and a precondition for meeting the goals is having the zone capacity. But that doesn't mean you're going to get the affordable housing, and we have to do more to figure out how to get the affordable housing.
Could I ask a question to you, Sibley, about, you sound like you're really involved on a more statewide level. Do you think there's any chance for a state inclusionary housing requirement? Because I think that would really, I know it's been talked about a little bit, and a lot of these state laws, like the density bonus law, talks about how it really wants to encourage affordable housing. But in a community like Santa Cruz, that has an inclusionary requirement, the density bonus affordable housing requirements are really undermined in terms of how they're being interpreted. And it would really, I think it would make a big difference statewide if there was a statewide inclusionary housing requirement. What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, I think it's a solid idea. I think the challenge is, I think probably why it has not really been worked on. There's been so much work to keep changing the bonus density law and have, more types of bonus densities, et cetera. What's a feasible inclusionary requirement is going to be so different in different parts of the state. And that's not rocket science necessarily. I mean, it's like, an optimal minimum wage law would have a higher than $15 minimum wage in some parts of the state and maybe lower in some parts, or whatever, but certainly different in different parts of the state. And we don't seem to be able to take that on very well. But I think it's the same kind of thing where, maybe there should be a minimum inclusionary requirement that comes out of some, calculation. But I haven't seen that. That'd be interesting.
Thank you. Next question is a little different. Is there a way to encourage public employers who own land, schools, counties, cities, to build workforce housing?
Well, so it's funny you should mention it. I'm on the City Planning Commission's Housing Subcommittee, and that's exactly what we've been working on. There's a special law, state law, that applies to school districts that encourages school districts to provide housing on land that they own. And the school district had talked to the city staff about the fact that the inclusionary requirements made it very hard for them. So the Housing Subcommittee has been working on an alternative approach that school districts could use that would not tie them so tightly to the inclusionary requirements, but give them more flexibility in terms of meeting affordability requirements, both either low or moderate. And hopefully, I'm hoping that's going to see the public light of day soon. And the subcommittee is also working on other public and maybe not so public employers providing housing as well on sites that they own. So this is, and it would be encouraging a higher number of units at the moderate income level, so that there would be affordability, but it wouldn't necessarily be low income affordability. And the hope is that that would make for a more financially feasible approach. So in the next month or so, I hope there'll be an item on the Planning Commission's agenda that's available to, you can watch the meetings, and we'll be discussing, and we'll be happy to have input on those conditions. The staff is working with the school district on the proposed approach.
Andy, that's so wonderful to hear, because of course, when we think about teachers and custodians and office staff in the schools not being able to live in their own area, we're all astonished. We want so much for them to be neighbors of ours, and to think that the schools who might have unused land could be able to do that for housing is wonderful.
Well, of course,
Sorry,
a tricky problem is how they're going to finance it. So I'm sorry.
I think that I've heard of this effort for the teachers, and it makes sense, but I just be more cautious with other employers. We don't want to create a sense of entrapment to an employer and an employee. And this is the hard balance where we're trying to find solutions. If we focus so much on just let's build the housing so people have it and work on the land that employers are offering, and we forget to ask the question of how is that being structured to prevent what could be seen as employer entrapment into a certain job, because the only housing that they can get is that one. So I do think that we got to just be careful and thoughtful about the nuance of that. Teachers are a little different in the job market, if you will, right? But I think if we're looking at it on a more extended base, then I think those questions about how do we ensure that independence for the people living in those houses as important.
I think that's a really excellent concern, and we have been talking about that through the need that the sponsor would have to provide a management plan to really deal with what happens if a tenant stops working for the school district. Do they get kicked out of their housing? That's really, as Ellen knows from the Housing Authority, if people's incomes go up, they don't necessarily lose their unit. They have to pay more in rent, but it's a tricky issue. But your concern is, I totally agree with.
All right, very good. Here is a question that has to do with City of Santa Cruz general plan zoning and development policy. If you look at a map, there is an inequity of development primarily east of the river, while the university has quadrupled in 40 years. Are you in favor of the corridor plan with the highest density on Soquel and water, with mid-rise building and lack of comparable infrastructure? And does it make sense with the growth factors of Santa Cruz?
Maria or Ellen, you guys want to jump in first? I feel like Andy and I always have a lot to say about all these things, but
So, you know, what we just heard was that the university is has its strategic plan out for review. People can comment on it. That they have objectives for housing, the increase in their students, and the 25% of the increase in their staff, and that we know it is a driver of our rents here in the city. I'm not as familiar with the division between whether we should, provide more housing on the west side or the east side, but I thought the corridor plan had been abandoned. I thought that had actually been dropped, and that they were no longer trying to just build up along the major corridors, SoCal, Water, Ocean, Mission. I think Maria might have something more information about making sure that wherever we're encouraging development, it's equitable.
I don't know if I have much more, but I would say that we're looking at multiple solutions that have to be considered. And it goes back to, I think the way Sibley stated in the beginning is very true, is what is the frame that we're addressing the housing developments that are being proposed and the strategies being proposed. There's a need to look at duplexes and fourplexes and single family zoning that is currently there. There's a need to look at deep restrictions around ADU development, and there's a need to look at denser development around areas that make sense, like downtown. And in main throughways, when we look at climate change, we look at changes in transportation, they make sense. Will it look different? Of course it will. But it will look a lot different for those people who are in overcrowded housing right now in Santa Cruz, making the jobs make it happen in the city. So I think that the most equitable thing that we can do is ensuring that people are housed, that the people in our community are housed. That's the most equitable thing that we can do. And ensuring that their voices are part of these community conversations, like having interpreters during webinars, having interpreters at planning commission meetings, having lines for conversation and interpreting for city hall conversations. I think those are all steps that, while are not directly looking at the developer that's being chosen or the plans that are being developed, ensure that people are engaged civically and that our sense of belonging increases in a say in what the city goes for. So I do want to mention something about the UCSC student growth and the impact on that, because I think the university does a lot of work to try to develop plans on their housing development to meet their growth plan. And I'll recognize that. However, one of the reasons we have this great push on the housing is not only the lack of units, but it's the cost that the housing is being provided to the students. And while the UCSC system is creating units, they're creating units that carry a lot of cost, while at the same time proclaiming to be an institution that is out there to recruit Latino and low-income students. These students cannot afford $1,100, $1,200 a rent for a double at a campus. So they end up overcrowding in single-family housing because it's cheaper, right? And so it's not just the number of units the university can provide, but what can the university, quite frankly, this is beyond UCSC, what can the UC Regents do to ensure that the housing that is being developed in UC campuses is actually affordable for the population of students that they're trying to recruit? And I think that's something that needs to be discussed more fully. But Sibley, you can go into the details of the other stuff.
well, I just had a couple of things. One is there's more nuance than what Ellen was saying on the corridors plan. The problem, I'm kind of neutral on the corridors plan. I think we should be having some density that we don't currently have zoned for somewhere. And a ton of community meetings went into the general plan, which approved the corridors plan. And that's supposed to be the decisive moment. And like it or hate it, that's supposed to be when it was decided that there would be a corridors upzoning, and it was decided that there was. And then we spent 10 years, re-adjudicating that, and yes, eventually stopped the zoning process. And unfortunately, now we're in the worst case scenario, which is from a planning point of view, which is that there is a general plan that has the corridor plan in it. And so to some degree, the density in that general plan that was approved with a big community process more than a decade ago, is there. And because of state laws and stuff, some of that can be used in developments, but we've never written zoning laws around that. So we're kind of in this limbo with it. In that's kind of a generalization, but that's the case. So what we really should do is pick once what we're going to do and stick with it, and then write the zoning rules to specify exactly how the zoning can happen, et cetera. Now, the other part of that question, though, I think got at, the sites of Santa Cruz, and I think there's some understandable points there. And yeah, we have this big source of demand, which is the university, but we don't upzone as much around that. And I think we should. I think we need to legalize building some areas of student housing out there on the west side and close to the university, and not just student housing, and then denser faculty staff housing, et cetera. And I think there's another frame besides what Andy said, which I understand. We want teeth to make sure this very convoluted university system for getting housing approved actually, produces housing as they grow. But, as you know, our UC houses a bigger percentage of its population than any of the other UCs. And we've known the long range plans of the university for decades, for 50 years now. We get a lot of warning about what the plans might be. And what I see it as is a number one party that hasn't kept up its side of the bargain is the city of Santa Cruz. Like, okay, we planted this UC there, and then see it grow, and we don't control that, and we should push them to keep building on campus, but we also have to, if it's going to be there, zone for some of that capacity off of campus too, and near campus, and with transit, et cetera. And not, to that point, it's not the most convenient thing to stick it on the opposite side of the city or way further in Live Oak, and et cetera. So I think we have to do our part of meeting, even if they're going to meet 100% of the growth from now on, we got to still deal with the demand that's been created over the last 50 years and do a better job of it. And to Maria's point, on and off campus, that's got to actually be affordable for the participants, the staff, and students.
I would recommend that people, if they haven't already, used the new bike path that runs along the rail line that goes from Bay Street to Natural Bridges Drive, that they go take a walk or take a bike ride along it. What struck me when I go there is how much vacant land there is at the far end. It's zoned industrial, but there is a great deal of land. So, I think one approach to deal with this equity issue of East Side, West Side is to do more than what state law already allows to ADUs by trying to upzone some of the West Side neighborhoods. But another is to really seriously consider what is the potential for additional housing development and multifamily housing development on sites that are pretty close to the university. On the Planning Commission, we've been dealing with the fallout of what was called the Corridors Plan. The Corridors Plan was really a misnomer. As Sibley says, the city council adopted a general plan that allowed for very high density increases along the East Side Corridor, Mission, and Ocean. State law at that time required that the zoning be consistent with the general plan. And the zoning was commercial zoning. It did not allow, I think, the commercial allowed 40 units an acre. The the general plan allowed up to 55 units an acre, and then you could get a density bonus of 35%. So the corridors plan, what was called the corridors plan, was an attempt to make those two consistent. And as Ellen says, it was eventually dropped because of opposition from the community. However, the state law changed, and it now says, well, they don't really have to be consistent anymore. The zoning doesn't have to be consistent. You have to follow the general plan. So the densities in the general plan are really what are legally mandated to the city now. The city has to follow that. The only way the city can have much say over development is what are called objective standards. Objective standards like parking, maybe like specific design, slope and stuff like that, could affect the ability of the city to influence a project. Now, what's an objective standard? The city now is going, the city staff is now working with the consultant on potential objective standards. And I think in the end, what it comes down to is really trying to reach some kind of balance between recognizing that probably there can be higher density in some of those locations on the corridors, but does it have to be at the absolute maximum? And my concern is that the staff keeps pushing everything to the absolute maximum, and there may be something in between that could significantly increase the density, but does not have to feel overwhelming either to the neighborhood or to the amount of traffic that's going to be on Soquel and Water. So, I think there were really two questions. One was the equity between East Side, West Side, but the other is, what's the status of that effort? And I think the legal answer is the general plan requirements prevail, but the city is looking at what are called objective standards to see what ability it has, what discretion it has to try to regulate that, those densities.
All right, thank you, Andy. We are almost out of time, but I want to ask one capstone question. And then I think after that, Erica has something to say about evaluations. Since the title of this conference is a question, is affordable housing possible? What do you say? Is it? And what do you want to say?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yes,
We have
absolutely.
examples right here in the city of Santa Cruz that show, we have 100% affordable complexes, so we have examples. It is possible.
Okay, Ellen, I'm going to say, though, that let's change the question. Is getting enough affordable housing possible?
That's a much more difficult question. And I'll say, how do you define enough? Are we going to be able to do what sort of I heard Maria advocating, everyone who needs housing should be able to get it? Is that achievable? Certainly not under the current, I don't think under the current resources, financial resources that are available locally to try to provide that given people's incomes. And, I think for me, it's not an either or question, it's a more or less question. And I think I'm sort of along the lines of what Ellen said, and actually with what a lot of what you were saying, to the extent we can do more affordable housing, we should be trying to do it. But the key is affordable. That's what we really need. That's what we really should be focusing on. And to the extent that that's what the result is, then I think that's a desirable way to go.
So I agree with all of you. And I would actually say that it also depends on what kind of city do we want.
Exactly.
Right. So, and there's work for affordable and there's low income and very low income affordable. So what kind of city do you want? Because that will depend exactly the enough question that will be dictated by that. It will dictate exactly everything decision in terms of density. It will dictate decisions around the type of housing that we push. And as a community, I think that is the most moral and hardest question to answer that people have to take home. What kind of city do you want? Because the reality is that we are displacing our families. The number of families with young children are leaving the city. The number of workers of color who can afford to live here are leaving the city. The low-income community is not raising their wages. So if we look at it as an integrated question about what kind of city do we want Santa Cruz to be, then it's up to us as the residents of the city to be willing to take what it takes to build the kind of city that we want to see happen. And to me, that includes everybody who works here should be able to live here. There is an economic justice component to that.
I completely agree with Maria. I think that if it were up to me and I was God, I would ask that everything stop, that we push a reset button, and that we ask the community, what is it you want to have? Do you want to have Silicon Valley and Santa Cruz, or do you want to have a city that serves the people who want to live here because they work here, and we start by serving them, or do we change the city the way it seems to be changing now? That's how I feel.
We're going to get all types of answers, but I think
It would be a good
you know,
question to ask, no?
yeah.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to say, I don't know is the answer is enough possible in any of these definitions of enough, but I think we can do better than we have been. And and not just a little better. I'll be disappointed if we only do a little better. I think, so my two things are, I hope it is possible. I think we should radically go for it. And I don't think it's possible for Santa Cruz to do it alone. I think we're only going to have enough affordable housing if California is making big strides to have enough affordable housing. And so we've got to be a part of a movement to do that statewide.
Good answer. And thank you all so much. This has been wonderful.
I
I'll
would
turn
like
it back
to-
over to Erica.
Thank you, Jim. I would like to thank Jim. I would like to thank Eva for translating nonstop. I see you try to catch up as we speak much too fast. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Andy, Sibley, Maria, Ellen. Your input is invaluable, and I think this was a very good conference. I hope we can do it again. I'm going to send everybody in the audience a number of questions. We would like to get your feedback on how we did yesterday and today, and what you would like to see happen in this year in terms of conferences, what topics are of interest to you, and we'd like to be able to make that happen. So thank you, everybody. Good night and have a great weekend. And yeah, thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.